To speak of prophecy is to enter regions of thought unfamiliar to, indeed alien to, the mental world so firmly established in the modern West by 3 centuries of virtually unchallenged scientific materialism, or should I say materialist science, because science is not necessarily materialist, surely. Every civilization may be seen as a development from certain ideas, certain premises, from which certain consequences necessarily follow, while others are precluded. The impressive material discoveries, technology and power, which have characterized our Western civilization, have nevertheless, as we are at this time uneasily beginning to discover, been at the expense of other excluded areas of experience and knowledge. Western science equates reality with a material universe. This world can be weighed and measured and quantified in terms of the infinitely large and the infinitesimally small, and only the quantifiable is deemed real. Indeed, this phase of civilization has been described by René Guénon in the title of his most famous book as The Reign of Quantity. The world of poetry itself can, in such a system, be accorded the status only of the imaginary, of make-believe, a game for children who have not acquired real, that is, factual, knowledge of the nature and causes of things. Prophecy claims also to be a revelation of truth, but of a truth for which a materialist worldview has no place. It is a concept relegated to the limbo of history of ideas. A prophet, according to the Oxford Dictionary, is one who speaks for God, another meaningless concept in terms of materialist ideologies, but one upon which great civilizations have been established, which hold the ground of reality to be not matter, whatever that may be, but mind or spirit, of which indeed matter may be but one manifestation. William Blake, who at the end of the 18th century reaffirmed in the face of materialist ideologies already gaining ascendancy in his time, the idea of prophecy, and he described his poems as prophecies. And at the supremacy of the materialist ideologies are being called in question only in our own time, and the prophetic role which speaks from and for the living spirit, which is the true agent of all we perceive as nature, is again beginning to receive our attention. Instead of deeming the universe a mechanism, the sensible world is seen to be a system of appearance, a maya, inseparable from the mind or spirit, which in perceiving also creates what it perceives. Everything is, in Blake's word, vision, and every natural effect has a spiritual cause and not a natural. A natural cause only seems. What then are we to understand by the word prophecy? In materialist terms, the word could at most be understood in the popular sense of foretelling the future. To Blake it certainly meant something more than and other than the foretelling of events such as we might read in the daily papers. Prophecy is concerned with other levels of reality than such things as Nostradamus and others have perhaps foretold. Truth of the prophetic order comes from the perceptions and judgments of the imagination. It is not like second sight, a faculty possessed by a handful of exceptionally endowed people, but latent in all. Like poetry, it is a gift of seeing and understanding the world, people, and events in terms of the imagination. Blake's writings, first and last, are a proclamation of the primacy of the imagination, which he calls the true man, as against the materialist view of man as his physical organism, the worm of 60 winters, which, according to the philosopher Locke, and the same view persists to this day, is, in Blake's words, naturally only a natural organ subject to sense. This view of man Blake vehemently denied. The poetic or prophetic character, he affirmed, is the true man. Later, he substituted the term imagination, identifying the imagination with the God within of the Protestant tradition in which he himself stood, and he named that inner presence Jesus the imagination. Jesus is, for Blake, the name of the universal and innate creative spirit experienced as a person and called in the Indian sacred tradition the Supreme Self. It is from this Supreme Self and not from the senses that knowledge derives. Nor does Blake use the term poetic genius or the later term imagination in the limited sense of the poet's muse, but in a far more comprehensive sense as the inspiration and knowledge, not of the arts alone, but of all humankind's deepest intuitions. He understood religions themselves to be of the same nature as poetry. The religions of all nations are derived from each nation's different reception of the poetic genius, which is everywhere called the spirit of prophecy. Religious differences, therefore, are merely cultural. As all men are alike, though infinitely various, so all religions, as all similars, have one source. The true man is the source, he being the poetic genius. Thus, imagination in Blake's sense does not mean imaginary, that is to say unreal, make-believe, but signifies, on the contrary, the principle of reality itself. Coleridge held the same view, distinguishing between imagination and fancy or make-believe. According to Coleridge's famous definition, the primary imagination I hold to be the living power and prime agent of all human perception, and as a repetition in the finite mind of the eternal act of creation in the infinite I am. More recently, Henri Corbin, the great Ismaili scholar, has introduced the word imaginal to signify this reality in contradistinction to the word imaginary, which has come in popular parlance to mean unreal. Coleridge's definition, like Blake's, identifies the imagination with the God within. But Blake's term, the divine humanity, is not, however, his own, but derives from Swedenborg, whose system is the ground of Blake's. To return to our original argument that the very conception of prophecy is incompatible with modern materialist ideologies, I must repeat that a view by which mind, spirit, imagination becomes the cause can by no means equate reality with Newton's measurable universe, which Blake calls an abstract void, but with immeasurable life. Blake declared that his own great task was to open the eternal worlds, to open the immortal eyes of man inwards into the worlds of thought, into eternity, ever expanding in the bosom of God, the human imagination. I am told that the Hebrew word for prophecy signifies bringing forth out of one's self, and that is also Blake's meaning. When poetry wrote that Jesus is God, he spoke as do mystics of all religions, not of a historical supernatural person, but of that universal indwelling divine presence. His Jesus the Imagination is the Swedish 18th century mystic Swedenborg's grand man of the heavens, that is, of the inner worlds, who is the many in one and one in many, of the innumerable multitudes of eternity, all humankind, past, present, and to come. The divine humanity is at once a person and a universe, since that universe is a region not of space, but of being. And I quote, "This world of imagination is the world of eternity. It is the divine bosom into which we shall all go after the death of the vegetated body. This world of imagination is infinite and eternal, whereas the world of generation or vegetation is finite and temporal. There exist in that eternal world the permanent realities of everything which we see reflected in this vegetable glass of nature. All things are comprehended in their eternal forms in the divine body of the Saviour, the true vine of eternity, the human imagination." Imagination is called the Saviour because it saves from the limitations of natural life and steps beyond these limits into the boundless eternity of immeasurable being. To some, conditioned as we are by the current assumptions of our society to a materialist paradigm, such affirmations may seem incomprehensible. To others, I may seem to be laboring the obvious. What is self-evident in terms, for example, of Indian and Far Eastern philosophic thought? There is in any case no question of Blake's divine humanity in any way resembling or preparing the way for the purely secular 19th century exaltation of the natural man in what is termed humanism. The supremacy of Jesus the Imagination resides solely in the reality of the God within. Blake speaks as a mystic who universalizes the divine human nature the Church attributes only to the historical Jesus. In his last years, the diarist Crabb Robinson questioned Blake on his opinion concerning the imputed divinity of Jesus Christ. Blake replied, "He is the only God." But then he added, "And so am I, and so are you. We are all coexistent with God," he said, members of the divine body. Humanism exalts the natural man, whom Blake calls the worm of 60 winters, who accumulates knowledge through experience, but by virtue of the imagination, the universal cosmic knowledge is available to whoever, poet or prophet, raises his mind into those regions. One thing alone makes a poet, Blake affirmed, imagination, the divine vision. Blake thus stands centrally within the Protestant tradition which he inherited when he declared that henceforth every man may converse with God and be a king and priest in his own house. Blake's own type of the inspired man is the poet Milton, who gives his name to Blake's prophetic book in which he proclaims the supremacy of the innate law of the imagination over the moral law of this world imposed by the empirical ego, Satan, the selfhood, prince of this world. Milton, great poet of the imagination, was, in Blake's sense of the word, a divinely inspired prophet whose Paradise Lost describes eternal realities of the imagination. Truth is not fact, or we could abdicate to our computers. As if public records were true, Blake indignantly exclaims. In Paradise Regained, Milton's Satan tempts Jesus by discoursing on the schools, Plato, Aristotle, and the later Stoics, Epicurus and the rest, and suggests that by acquisition of learning, Jesus, surely here the true prototype of Blake's Jesus, the imagination, can prepare himself to be a king complete. Jesus refuses Satan by claiming light from above. Think not but that I know these things, or think I know them not. Not therefore am I short of knowing what I ought. He who receives light from above, from the fountain of light, no other doctrine needs, though granted true. But these are false, or little else but dreams, conjectures, fancies, built on nothing firm. The first and wisest of them all professed to know this only, that he nothing knew. Milton is affirming that inspiration transcends learning. However many books wise men have said are wearisome, who reads incessantly, and to his reading brings not a spirit and a judgment equal or superior, and what he brings, what need he elsewhere seek? Uncertain and unsettled still remains, deep versed in books and shallow in himself. Jesus then praises the prophets of Israel as men divinely taught, who excel all the oratory of Greece and Rome. Thus it is with good reason that Blake sees in Milton the type of the inspired man, that is to say, the poet-prophet. Blake's Milton, who even more explicitly and eloquently denounces human wisdom in the name of inspiration, is a portrait that only draws in clearer lines the author of Paradise Lost. If for Milton himself Jesus was not explicitly identified with the innate imagination, he is implicitly so, for Milton's light from above, from the fountain of light, is that same God within as Blake's Jesus the imagination. Blake's Milton, the poet-prophet, also confronts and renounces Satan, who tempts the poet with acquired knowledge and comes into the world renouncing the empirical selfhood whose knowledge comes through the senses, memory, recorded history. The poet comes in self-annihilation and the grandeur of inspiration to cast off rational demonstration by faith in the Saviour, to cast off the rotten rags of memory by inspiration, to cast off Bacon, Locke, and Newton from Albion's covering, to take off his filthy garments and clothe him with imagination, to cast aside from poetry all that is not inspiration. Bacon, Newton, and Locke, those culture heroes of scientific materialism, are the enemies of the innate knowledge of the living imagination, the murderers of Jesus, Blake declares, Jesus being the imagination, are those who mock at eternal life, who pretend to poetry that they may destroy imagination, who by imitation of nature's images drawn from remembrance. The prophetic spirit, as understood by Blake, is by no means remote, but that friend with whom Blake conversed daily as man to man. During the 19th century, poetry and the other arts had become ever increasingly wedded to nature's images and expressive of the finite individual on the natural plane, as at best in the narrative poems of Browning and Tennyson, and in the novel, the literary form which above all others narrates the annals of natural life. The tide began to turn once more at the end of the century, and by way of Gilchrist's Life of William Blake, completed by William Michael Rossetti, brother of Dante Gabriel and Christina, the poets, Blake's thought came to influence first the pre-Raphaelites, and through them the young W.B. Yeats, who was to become, with Edwin J. Ellis, a member of that same circle, the first editor of Blake's prophetic books. The school which proclaimed a doctrine of art for art's sake may seem remote from Blake's vision of the indwelling imagination as a divine presence, yet there is a connecting link. Blake made no distinction between the poetry of the imagination and prophecy, nor in this sense between art and religion. Near the end of his life, he inscribed on his famous engraving of the Laocoon group his deepest beliefs in this manner: a poet, a painter, a musician, an architect. The man or woman who is not one of these is not a Christian, as indeed follows from the identification of Jesus with the imagination. Prayer is the study of art. Praise is the practice of art. Fasting, etc., all relate to art. The outward ceremony is Antichrist. The eternal body of man is the imagination, that is, God himself, the divine body, Jesus. We are his members. It manifests itself in his works of art. In eternity, all is vision. In his engravings of the Book of Job, Blake depicts in the first place Job and his sons and daughters sitting as on a pious Sunday doing no manner of work, beneath a tree whereon hang musical instruments unheeded. In the last plate, the same men and women are present, but each playing on one of these instruments, or singing, or reading from a scroll representing poetry, painting, and music, the three powers in man of conversing with paradise, which the flood did not sweep away. But a secular conception of art for art's sake, in exalting art as a supreme value while taking no account of its sacred source, is paradoxically a diminishment, just as man is diminished when the natural man, with his empirical skills and acquired knowledge, is exalted to a supremacy man can possess only as the bearer of the divine image. Yeats, as a young man, seems poised on a knife edge between the aestheticism of his contemporaries, Pater and Wilde and the Pre-Raphaelites, and the prophetic vision of Blake. In an essay on William Blake and the imagination, Yeats describes Blake as having announced a religion of art of which no man dreamed in the world about him, and this is true. Yet, as Yeats expands the theme, we are aware that there has been a subtle sleight of hand. Yeats writes, in his, that is Blake's, time, educated people believed that they amused themselves with books of imagination, but that they made their souls by listening to sermons or by doing or not doing certain things. When they had to explain why serious people like themselves honored the great poets, they were hard put to it for lack of good reasons. In our time, we are agreed that we make our souls out of some of the great poets of ancient times, or out of Shelley, or Wordsworth, or Goethe, or Balzac, or Flaubert, or Count Tolstoy in the books he wrote before he became a prophet and fell into a lesser order, or out of Mr. Whistler's pictures, while we amuse ourselves, or at best make a poorer sort of soul by listening to sermons or by doing or not doing certain things. We write of great writers, even of writers whose beauty would once have seemed an unholy beauty, with rapt sentences, like those our fathers kept for the Beatitudes and the mysteries of the Church. And no matter what we believe with our lips, we believe with our hearts that beautiful things, as Browning said in his one prose essay that was not in verse, have lain burningly in the divine hand, and that when time has begun to wither, the divine hand will fall heavily on bad taste and vulgarity. The sleight of hand lies in the very different senses in which both terms of the phrase "a religion of art" were understood by Blake, the prophet, and the aesthetes who were in the 19th century preaching against the Philistines in the name of taste. Would Tolstoy and Flaubert and Whistler, would Balzac have seemed to Blake to have been inspired by his daughters of inspiration or by his daughters of memory? True, Blake was himself aware of the difficulty of making hard and fast distinctions, for he admits that the work of the muses of memory is seldom without some vision, but the distinction has to be made, Blake insists, for the sake of eternal life, because, that is, works inspired by vision originate in the eternal life of the imagination, whereas secular art is an imitation or manipulation of nature's images drawn from remembrance. Yeats himself falls short of Blake, though less so than a host of his contemporaries who made a religion of secular art as such. It is all too easy to blur the distinction so clearly seen by Blake, for whom the source of true art lay always beyond the reach of all those acquired talents and skills which may be learned in the schools of human wisdom within the innate imagination. However, in fairness to Yeats, we must say that the whole of his poetic life was an attempt to attain Blake's vision, for whom it was so simple a matter to converse daily as man, with the God within. Blake had written those lines we all know. I give you the end of a golden string, only wind it into a ball. It will lead you in at heaven's gate, built in Jerusalem's wall. Yeats, who by magical techniques, psychical research, and other means had attempted to discover that gate, missed, it may be, the direct way, great poet though he was. Yeats followed magic as a means to unbar the gate, not only between the sleeping and the waking mind, but between our own minds and the one great memory, the memory of nature herself. He believed as an article of magical faith that this great mind and great memory can be evoked by symbols. Magic is an enchantment, depending on the seemingly transitory mind made out of many minds, and the poet or musician is an enchanter who creates or reveals images from beyond the doors or gates between ourselves and that greater mind. Poet or musician in former times kept the doors too of those less transitory minds, the genius of the family, the genius of the tribe, or it may be, when he was mighty-souled enough, the genius of the world. And Yeats goes on to contrast that imaginative activity with the workings of the modern secular mind. Our history speaks of opinions and discoveries, but in ancient times when, as I think, men had their eyes ever upon those doors, history spoke of commandments and revelations. They looked as carefully and as patiently towards Sinai and its thunders as we look towards parliaments and laboratories. We are always praising men in whom the individual life has come to perfection, but they were always praising the one mind, their perfection of all perfection. Again, one wonders if Yeats meant exactly what Blake meant. A fool sees not the same tree that a wise man sees, Blake wrote, and to me this world is all one continued vision of fancy or imagination. Blake could see a world in a grain of sand and a heaven in a wild flower, hold infinity of the palm of your hand and eternity in an hour. But Yeats's poet-magician, or Yeats the poet-magician, seeks to penetrate the frontiers of anima mundi and of the world of discarnate spirits as though realities of the imagination lay beyond, not in, the here and now. Blake looked not with but through the eye at all times, whereas Yeats, understandably indeed, sought for proofs and evidence of the supernatural. High as Yeats stands as a poet, Blake's sublime simplicity eludes him. Blake did not for a moment doubt that there are other worlds, other levels of reality beyond the world of generation, but for him there were no frontiers to penetrate. In the West at least, owe it to C.G. Jung that whole areas of knowledge of the inner regions of the mind, long discarded by materialist science as meaningless within terms of natural science, have been again illuminated by a recognition of the order of things to which they belong. All cosmologies of the realm of mind and spirit recognize the human inner world as basically fourfold. Jung was to rediscover and redefine the inner worlds of feeling, reason, sensation, and intuition. These four universes were likewise known to Blake, whose four living creatures, so named from the books of Ezekiel and Revelation, the Zers, he has characterized and personified so vividly in his prophetic books. These four are to be found in all ancient mythologies. In Egyptian mythology is found a prototype, as Jung points out, of the angel, eagle, lion, and ox of St. John's vision of the four-faced humanity, of Ezekiel's vision of the four-faced gods of India, the four elements of medieval alchemy, and so on. Blake understands them at once as regions of consciousness and of persons. When Blake is difficult to understand, it is never that he is vague and imprecise, but rather that he speaks clearly of what to him was plain and simple, although within the terms of materialist thought, meaningless. Nothing could be plainer than 6 lines in which Blake describes his fourfold vision. And here it is to be noted that the four worlds are arranged in a vertical scale of ascent. Now I a fourfold vision see, and a fourfold vision is given to me. 'Tis fourfold in my supreme delight, and threefold in soft Beulah's night, and twofold always. May God us keep from single vision and Newton's sleep. To how many of those of us who know these lines by heart do they communicate those realities which he names? Yet to many systems known to Blake himself, that paradigm is fundamental. Plato knew 4 worlds, from the first cause, descending to the intelligible world, to the archetypal, to the world of souls, with the natural world as the lowest of the series, not, as for materialist theories, the cause and origin of higher worlds, but the effect of these. The Jewish tree of God, the Kabbalistic paradigm, likewise recognizes a transcendent world of Atziluth, with 3 lower hierarchies of Yetzirah and Briah, of which Malkuth, the created world, is the lowest term. Swedenborg knew the celestial, the spiritual, and the world of generation. Blake's 4 correspond to these Swedenborgian orders with Newton's sleep as an abstract and dead world, which is, as he says, outside existence, the 4th and lowest. According to Swedenborg, the natural, spiritual and celestial orders differ not in degree but in kind. Yeats, commenting on Blake and Swedenborg in the essay preface to Ellis and Yeats's explanation of Blake's symbolic system, sees in this difference the very basis of symbolism. For if the worlds differ in kind and not merely in degree, Yeats writes, no mere analysis of nature as it exists outside our minds can solve the problems of mental life. Within each world, there are continuous degrees, which Swedenborg likens to degrees of visual clearness, decreasing as it recedes from the theme of which is its source, till it is lost in obscurity. But degrees that are not continuous differ as do cause and effect, that which produces and that which is produced. The materialist thinker, Yeats goes on to explain, sees continuous where he should see discrete, and thinks of the mind not merely as companioning, but as actually one with the physical organism. Everything is of the same order of reality, but you cannot, Yeats insists, demonstrate one degree from another, and no increase of natural observations and sensations could in itself awaken to being or open the intellectual faculties. Only by way of metaphor, or as Swedenborg terms it, correspondence, do perceptions of one order relate to another, by a transformation that lifts them into a new world. Study science till you are blind, study intellect till you are cold, Blake wrote in the margins of Swedenborg's Divine Love and Wisdom. Yet science cannot teach intellect, much less can intellect teach affection. For Blake, as for Swedenborg, love is the highest term of the ascent of the fourfold ladder. All these levels are, as Blake knew, present at all the time, but according as we expand or contract what Blake calls our infinite senses, so are we attuned to lower or higher worlds. Only if we recognize that there are multiple levels of being and states of mind, lower and higher worlds, can we speak of inspiration. Nor does all inspiration derive from the same world, but may come from the vital, or the level of the soul, or the still higher archetypal source. The prophetic genius to which Blake had laid claim brings its knowledge from the source itself, the fountain of light. To most these things must seem mere hearsay, or perhaps occasionally glimpsed from afar. Yet Blake himself believed and affirmed that the prophetic spirit is not given only to a few, but innate in all, though unawakened in those whom Blake, following Plotinus, calls sleepers, a sleep that is to higher worlds. The prophet is one who summons us to awake. Milton, his type of the prophetic poet, Blake calls the awakener, who speaks from the innate spirit in all, to the spirit, from the spirit innate in all to the spirit innate in all. Such is the supreme poetry of the Bible, Shakespeare's highest flights, or of Shelley, or Blake's own, or the music of Schubert or Bach, and such supreme poetry and music, paradoxically, causes us no surprise, but rather recognition, as if we had always known these things, as indeed the divine indwelling spirit in us knows all. There's much fine poetry on the natural level, nature poetry like that of John Clare or Gerard Manley Hopkins, enhancing, celebrating the sensible world and its creatures and our living participation in it. Much of the most beautiful poetry comes from the world of feeling, of the individual. Much of Shakespeare, Keats's world, Thomas Hardy, or the songs of every folk tradition of Ireland or Scotland, or England's madrigals, or those Italian and Elizabethan sonnets, which carry human feeling to a point of refinement that has created civilization in civilized ages. And from beyond this world of feeling we hear, rarely but unmistakably, another voice, as from an order that would once have been called the celestial hierarchies. Rilke wrote in our own century of the great angels behind the stars, whose communications are universal and mysterious, summoning us, as it were, from beyond ourselves, our individual selves, into those regions of supreme delight Blake knew. There is, on the other hand, much so-called nature poetry which does no more than record the observations of single vision and Newton's sleep, and which progressively dissolves nature into a formless chaos of impressions, and without resonance from higher worlds of meaning and qualities, denudes its forms. Such indeed has been the story of the progressive invasion of our society by materialist ideologies. The arts, which in their very nature exist to reflect the higher worlds in terms of correspondence of symbol and metaphor, have become opaque to those worlds which, when forgotten or denied, become inaccessible, out of earshot. In Yeats's words, "The falcon cannot hear the falconer." We live in such a time in which the prophetic voice is seldom heard, since the poets themselves no longer listen or transmit the messages of wisdom that might be heard if we listened. Nature has grown opaque, and soul's world of feeling, unilluminated from those higher regions of the mind on which that world depends, becomes a closed world of egoistic narcissism, leading progressively from trivialization to nihilistic despair. Only when each degree is open to that upon which it depends can the universal circulate and flow within the tree whose roots are above and whose branches in the lower world. The prophetic voice is out of earshot of the closed frontiers of a materialist ideology. The poetry consistent with such an ideology can rise no higher than a perhaps impassioned or accurate description of current affairs, seen in the light of political or other current values, and which the daily press could voice just as well or better. Poetry, and poetry alone, operates on the vertical axis of the four worlds, opening a way of communication between lower and higher, narrower and fuller experience. Logically, there can be no place for poetry in terms of a materialist view of mankind and our universe, for it is precisely to communicate the values of higher degrees or worlds that the arts are empowered. Not all poets are prophets, since each writes only from that level or degree to which he is open, nor are all prophets poets in the narrow sense of the term, yet poetry and prophecy derive from the same source. The true man is the source, as Blake says, the human imagination. The prophet does not speak for God from outside and beyond our humanity, but from within it, from Swedenborg's and Blake's divine humanity, on whom Yeats comments, "The man he speaks of is the inner and not the outer being, the spiritual and not the physical, the highest ideal, the human form divine, as he calls it, and not the extrinsic body." The mind or imagination or consciousness of man may be said to have two poles, the personal and the impersonal, Yeats continues. When we act from the personal, we tend to bind our consciousness down as to a fiery center. When, on the other hand, we allow our imagination to expand away from this egoistic mood, we become vehicles for the universal light and merge in the universal mood. Thus, we must regard prophecy in terms of that cosmology which holds man to be himself coextensive with the cosmic whole, and prophecy to be at once our own highest expression and that voice of the God within, affirmed by the mystics of all traditions. To quote Yeats once more, the mood of the seer, no longer bound by the particular experience of the body, spreads out and enters into the particular experiences of an ever-widening circle of our lives and beings, for it will more and more grow one with that portion of the mood essence that is common to all that lives. The circle of individuality will widen out until other individualities are contained within it and their thoughts. He who has thus passed into the impersonal portion of his own mind perceives that it is not a mind but all minds. Hence Blake's statement that Albion, or man, once contained the starry heavens, and his description of their flight from him as he materialized. When once a man has entered into this, his ancient state, he perceives all things with the eyes of God. Of Blake's prophetic books, and who was for Yeats the supreme poet, that is Shelley. Blake had known Mary Wollstonecraft, mother of Shelley's second wife Mary, daughter of Godwin, the political economist. Probably Blake's visions of the daughters of Albion was inspired by Mary Wollstonecraft, two of whose books Blake had illustrated. It is not hard to suppose that a copy of Blake's book might have been in Godwin's library. Blake's championing of the cause of free love and the cause of women seems like a bridge which unites Blake's with Shelley's proclamations of the freedom of the soul. For Shelley's supreme poem on the realms of love, Prometheus Unbound, likewise discourses not on the politics of this world, but sees earthly things with the eyes of the soul from a higher degree in the scale of being. When Matthew Arnold called Shelley an ineffectual angel, he spoke as a man of this lower world, to be applauded only by those who have little understanding of the power of angels to effect events through those inner worlds which are the soul's native country. Prometheus Unbound is concerned not with some political utopia, but with the eternal reality of the universe of love that we all recognize and in our hearts desire, and which those only enter who can attain imaginatively that universe Shelley describes, whose freedom is not one that can be conferred by any change of existing laws. All spirits are enslaved which serve things evil, Shelley wrote, whose freedom, like Blake's, was a state of the soul. Shelley excels in his gift of creating personae of those archetypes whose reality is of our inner worlds, recognized by all because these forms are inhabitants of the universal, not of the personal mind. Prometheus, like Blake's Albion, is the universal man. Asia, beloved of Prometheus, represents the soul, the anima, and does not Asia, and it is specifically India, of which Shelley was thinking, represent in contrast with the Promethean materialist West, the soul. There are other soul figures, like the lady of the sensitive plant, in the use of enchanted landscapes so characteristic of his poetry, of symbolic rivers, caverns, mountains and isles, wind and light and night skies. Shelley is the supreme master of symbolic thought, and so only can be read with full understanding, beautiful as many of his poems are in terms of their natural description. But for Shelley, natural images are a metaphorical discourse through which he invokes soul's country. We may read these correspondences as we would read the language of a dream, as indeed we should read dreams as if these were poems. Thus, whereas Shelley's friend Byron entered the struggle for Greek independence on a political level and gave his life for that cause, Shelley is concerned with that same struggle in the light of the politics of eternity. For him, the issue was the eternal struggle between tyranny on behalf of those abiding, against tyranny, on behalf of those abiding values that for Shelley were those first defined in an earlier Greece by her philosophers. In sacred Athens, near the fane of wisdom, Pity's altar stood. Serve not the unknown God in vain, but pay that broken shrine again, love for hate and tears for blood. The protagonists in Shelley's Hellas are Mahmud, the Turkish ruler of Greece, who is the type of worldly power, of tyranny, and the prophetic genius is personified by the deathless figure of Ahasuerus. Shelley takes the name from the medieval legend of the wandering Jew, who possesses the cosmological knowledge of the universal mind. All past and future ages are known to him. As an archetype, he may remind some of Jung's figure of the wise old man who may appear under various guises in our dreams. Ahasuerus is so old, he seems to have outlived the world's decay. The hoary mountains and the wrinkled ocean seem younger still than he. But from his eye looks forth a life of unconsumed thought, which pierces the present and the past and the to come. Some say that this is he whom the great prophet Jesus, the son of Joseph, for his mockery mocked with the curse of immortality. Some feign that he is Enoch. Others dream he was pre-Adamite and has outlived cycles and generations and of ruin. Enoch was the one son of Adam who was exempt from death. Thus, the knowledge of Shelley's potent archetypal figure of the universal mind is not personal but ageless and cosmic. Shelley's Mahmud, as a ruler of this world, is concerned only to know the outcome of the war in which he is engaged, and for that purpose consults Ahasuerus. He attributes to him that same worldly knowledge Milton's Satan offered Jesus in Paradise Regained. Mahmoud says, "Thou art an adept in that difficult law of Greek and Frank philosophy. Thou numberest the flowers and thou numberest the stars. Thou severest element from element. The spirit is present in the past and sees the birth of this old world through all its cycles of desolation and of loveliness. And when man was not, and how man became the monarch and the slave of this low sphere and all its narrow circles." But as Ahasuerus replies, "Sultan, talk no more of thee and me, the future and the past, but look on that which cannot change, the one, the unborn and the undying." And he speaks in words that suggest those of the Lord Krishna. All is contained in each. Dodona's forest to an acorn cup is that which has been or will be to that which is, the absent to the present. Thought alone and its quick elements, will, passion, reason, imagination, cannot die. They are what that which they regard appears, the stuff whence mutability can weave all that it hath dominion o'er, worlds, worms, empires, and superstitions. What has thought to do with time or place or circumstance? Of all the English poets, it is Shelley who is most learned in the Platonic and Neoplatonic literature, the Western branch of the universal and unanimous tradition of the perennial philosophy, which in India finds its supreme expression in Vedanta and in the Gita, known alike to Blake and to Shelley in Wilkins's first translation of that work into English. Shelley's art seems to epitomize all that Coleridge meant when he wrote of the imagination as essentially vital. It dissolves, diffuses, dissipates in order to recreate. Fancy, on the contrary, the merely imaginary in the sense of make-believe, has no other counters to play with but fixities and definites. The fancy is indeed no other than a mode of memory emancipated from the order of time and space. Shelley employs nature's images as a language, humanity's primordial language, older than other words, to speak of realities of soul and spirit. Shelley does not assemble his images by choice, as it seems, but summons his magical world as a whole, like a dream, which is its own meaning, and in which every part, as in music, is essential to the whole. So with Ahasuerus and his world, in which every natural image serves as a metaphor for those meanings and values that belong not to the outer but the inner worlds. Ahasuerus, the cosmic wisdom, cannot be met with unless he be summoned from those regions beyond the reach of the common mind which he inhabits. He who would question him must sail alone at sunset, where the stream of ocean sleeps around these foamless isles when the young moon is westering as now, and evening airs wander upon the wave, and when the pines of that bee-posturing isle, green Erebinthus, quench the fiery shadow of his gilt prow within the sapphire water, then must the lonely helmsman cry aloud, "Ahasuerus," and the caverns round will answer, "Ahasuerus." If his prayer be granted, a faint meteor will arise, lightning him over Marmara, and a wind will rush out of the sighing pine forest, and with the wind a storm of harmony unutterably sweet. It is not hard to understand from such passages as those describing Ahasuerus why for Yeats, Shelley rather than Blake himself even, is the supreme poet, uniting in his symbolic virtuosity meaning and beauty from the three worlds. What as natural description could surpass the fiery shadow of a gilt prow within the sapphire water, the faint meteor, and the wind that will rush out of the sighing pine forests with a storm of harmony, the sunset where the stream of ocean sleeps around those foamless isles when the young moon is westering? With what virtuosity does the poet use these images from nature as the language of correspondences, as metaphors of the soul's country. As in our dreams, each image is fraught with meaning and value. Nothing, as in the outer world, is merely neutral, a fact observed, nor is any detail added which does not serve, again as in our dreams, to communicate reality of another order than that of common daily observation of objects. The time is twilight, between the light of common day and the mystery of darkness, between the sleeping and the waking mind, as Yeats has described the place of poetic inspiration. The summoner of secret wisdom must go in solitude, for his is an inner journey none can share. The sea cavern doubtless signifies for Shelley Porphyry's famous cave of the nymphs, sacred shrine where life itself emerges from the source, hidden in impenetrable darkness. That mysterious place is inhabited by the demonesi, daimons, messengers between worlds, intelligences once known as angels, those messengers who on Jacob's ladder ascend and descend between heaven and earth, the higher and the lower worlds. Shelley was learned in Greek mythology, which for him was the language of his imaginative discourse, and he uses the term daimon, which is free from religious connotation. So the resonances of meaning are evoked by Shelley's potent symbols. Ahasuerus, whose knowledge embraces all worlds, may be discovered by the human dreamer in search of the inner realms of soul itself. Ahasuerus knows that the present and the past are idle shadows of thought's eternal flight, and admonishes Mahmud to commune with that portion of thyself which was ere thou didst start for this brief race whose crown is death. None can approach that frontier on which we live without awe, that sense of the sacred which can be experienced but never defined. The prophetic voice speaks from that mystery which in its nature is beyond comprehension. It is in India alone that these regions of mind have from time immemorial been the theme of spiritual teachings and scriptures, that India of the imagination all three poets, Blake and Shelley and Yeats above all, had seen afar. For the authors of the Vedas, the ultimate reality is bliss. Being, consciousness, bliss. Bliss not as an attribute of being and consciousness, but of the very nature of these. Being is bliss. Consciousness is bliss. For Blake also, bliss, delight, was the heart and essence of life itself in its purity. Arise, you little glancing wings, and drink your bliss, for everything that lives is holy, Blake wrote. Yeats likewise, bitterly aware as he was of this world's darkness, and so indeed were Blake and Shelley, knew also that beyond and within that darkness itself, the living imagination discerns that deathless and eternal essence whose being and whose consciousness is bliss. It is in one of Yeats's darkest poems, the Gaias, that he affirms, as all prophetic poets before him, that the deepest truth lies beyond this low sphere and all its narrow circles. After describing the sack of Troy, type of all civilizations that fall to ruin, Yeats continues, "What matter, though none nightmare ride on top, and blood and mire the sensitive body stain? What matter? Heave no sigh, let no tear drop. A greater, a more gracious time is gone. For painted forms or boxes of make-up in ancient tombs I sighed, but not again. What matter? Out of cavern comes a voice, and all it knows is that one word, rejoice." The same voice, surely, as from Ahasuerus' cavern, travelled over the waters in a music unutterably sweet, from higher worlds or regions of being exempt from mortality, regions known to Blake in his supreme delight. That delight is not caused by any contingent circumstance, nor can it be removed by time's destruction of all things in this world of generation and death. This joy, ananda, bliss, eternal delight, is the ultimate truth told by the prophetic utterance from beyond all words. And finally, to India, fountain of all traditions of that sacred knowledge known to Blake, to Shelley, and to Yeats. That voice of joy that comes from Yeats's cavern, with its overtones of the cavern of Ahasuerus, may be traced also to another source in the Upanishads, well known to Yeats, since his own translation of the 10 principal Upanishads made with his master Sri Purohit Swami was published in 1937. At the time, he was also working on his last poems. There is yet another cave in that famous Katha Upanishad, in which the story is told of the youth Nachiketas, who confronted death himself in order to learn the truth of man's ultimate nature. The cycle of death and rebirth, death tells him, is for the ignorant, but the wise find the eternal self. The wise, meditating on God, this is Yeats's translation, concentrating their thoughts, discovering in the mouth of the cavern, deeper in the cavern, that self, that ancient self, difficult to imagine, more difficult to understand, past beyond joy and sorrow. The man that, hearing from the teacher and comprehending, distinguishes nature from the self, goes to the source. That man attains joy, lives forever in that joy. The fire that leads to heaven also, Death tells his pupil, came out of the cavern. What is this cavern? Doubtless it is also Plato's cavern, the world, but it is, according to the Katha Upanishad, the heart. The self is every man's secret, yet few find that person in the heart who is maker of past and future. That person, no bigger than a thumb, burning like a flame without smoke, maker of past and future, the same today and tomorrow. That is self. The self manifests in all things, and yet is above and beyond all created form, and that self is the source of joy. He is one, governor, self of all, creator of many out of one. He that dare discover him within rejoices. What other dare rejoice? He is imperishable, among all things that perish, life of all life. He, though one, satisfies every man's desire. He that dare discover him within knows peace. What other dare know peace? Surely Yeats had in mind these words, for who, thinking of numb nightmare, blood and mire, and the passing of all beautiful things, dare know peace, or speak those words, what matter, in the face of death, but those who in the cavern of the heart have heard the voice of prophecy that bids us rejoice.